Welcome everyone, welcome. We're back for another part two for our grapes, and thank you very much for joining. I see that everybody's giving us the weather report here in the chat, and it looks like it's a real mixed bag. We've got everything from snow to nice days to rain to thunderstorms. We had a bit of a thunderstorm this morning, and it has pretty much cleared off, and just kind of a hazy kind of look now. So anyway, so here we go, and let's jump right in. There we go. All right, so this is our reference. This is where we left off last week. If you missed part one, you can look that up on my channel. We do have part one. So the colors that I was using here were mostly Da Vinci watercolors. I've got a phthalo blue. This is a red shade. Somebody asked last week, was it a red shade or a green shade? It's a red shade that I'm using. I also used some Aureolin, which is in Da Vinci, it's a mixture, and I used the phthalo blue to help shade some of this. I also used a little bit of permanent rose in here. So now it's time. We've established where the grapes are. We've established the shapes and so on. Now it's time to build. So you can see that this wash back in here really isn't very smooth. And that often happens to me on a first wash. So the solution is a second wash. As you might have guessed. A second wash can do a tremendous amount to smooth out an uneven wash. So I'm going to take a large round brush. This is a number 12 synthetic round, and I'm using another palette here because this is the palette that has my phthalo blue in it. And I'll bring that out, and you can tell by my palette that this is a staining color. It has stained my palette. So I'm going to bring a lot out. Now, my paint looks really, really watery here because before I started, about 10 minutes before, I dropped in several drops of water in each of my wells of the colors that I might be using so that they get soft and gooey. There's nothing worse than trying to get rich color out of a dried well. Just before I start, I am going to adjust this camera over here. It looks like it's a little bit on the dark side. Once again, I had another power outage. We seem to be having an awful lot these days, and the every time it resets everything. So I'm just going to quickly let's see. There, I'll adjust this one, brighten it up a little bit. There we go. All right, so then you can see that palette a lot better. Okay, so now we're going to, I'm going to wet this area. If I wet the area first, of course, that's going to make it a lot easier for me to apply the color, but I'm not going to even really rinse out my brush. I've still got some paint in it. I just went into my water and picked up some water here to get this really nice and wet. I'm going to go as carefully as I can around the grapes because, of course, the shape of the grapes is kind of an important thing. So I will slow down a bit, but what I need to do is keep this leading edge. This is the edge that's going to continue. They call that a leading edge, and that's got to stay wet. If I get too involved and forget about what's up here and don't keep that edge wet, I'm in trouble because that's going to make a hard line. So I'm not going to worry about those little bits for right now. I'll come back to those. And I'm really filling up this brush. I'm like loading it up. And when I'm in the big areas, I'm using the side of the brush. I'm also using a really, really light pressure on my brush. I'm not, and I see this quite often. People like press and push the paint around. don't just use the lightest pressure possible on the paper. First of all, it keeps the paper in better condition, and secondly, it'll even out your wash more uniformly because you're putting more of a puddle right on top. So it's going to melt together better if you've got a puddle sitting on the surface. So this is going to make it darker, more even, and of course it looks a lot darker than it's going to dry. It's, of course, we already know by now that every time you paint, it dries lighter because that's watercolor for you. That is a normal thing for watercolor. I'm going to move this mouse out of the way. I don't need that. Using the point of my brush to get into those little corners. Don't paint with your brush like this trying to get into the corners. Use the point of your brush to get into corners. You'll get much more accurate, sharp points to it. And of course, having a brush with a good point certainly does make a difference as well. Keep that area there nice and wet. And you can already see this wash is looking a little darker, but it's also looking a lot smoother. What happens when you lay another layer on top of a first layer is that it softens up the layer underneath. And even though it's a week old, I can soften up that layer underneath and get that paint to sort of move around. This is nice and runny though. I don't want to have any dried up paint or thicker, not runny paint on my brush as I'm doing a big wash like this. That kind of defeats the purpose. I need to have things really wet, and I'm coming down to the bottom here, and this lower edge, remember last week we talked about this lower edge being soft. So just shaping this grape a little better. There we go. So as we get down to this lower edge, I'm not going to have my paint quite as wet right here. So I'm going to blot my brush, and now I am just sort of using a blotted brush here to come down to the bottom so that it sort of fades off and looks a little bit fuzzy. That's actually what I want. In fact, I think I'll pull up a little bit of color right here just to lighten that a little bit. And I can move this paint around quite easily now. It's all nice and wet. But we have a light area through here. So what I'm going to do with that, so I'm not going to go in with a wet brush because that's going to just give me a great big blossom. So I'm drying my brush, and I can lift through here. And that's going to give me a very soft highlight, right? That'll lighten that area up. But I'm doing this while the paint is still nice and fluid and runny. So I can get the illusion of this this jar. If you recall, this was a like a frosted jar beside the grapes. And I'm going to come in here and lift a little bit right here too. This is really getting a little bit too dark right here, so I'm pulling up a little bit of color. Right in here. There we go. So we've got everything in the background nice and soft. I mean, you can sort of envision that as a jar now. So we're going to leave that to dry. Hopefully that'll dry nice and uniform. And I'm going to rinse out my brush really well. And I'm going to, I can't work, of course, next to anywhere that it's wet right now, but I can work elsewhere. So let me grab my reference picture again. Now, you might remember last week I had mentioned about printing on copy paper and how the colors are going to end up a lot different than, say, the digital version here. So and the digital version was also a little bit different than the grapes themselves. So the grapes are gone, but I'm going to go with something a little bit more like this. I'm going to use this as a guideline for placement of shadows and things, but color-wise I'm going to go with this one. So I'm going to come in, and I think that some of the yellows in here need to start warming up a little bit. So I'm going to go with a little bit of a warm yellow instead. So warm yellow that I'm using is a gamboge, and I'm going to come in on this grape here with this warm yellow. And I'm probably going to end up, see, I ended up with a little bit of a dark line around this grape. I'm not worrying about those things right now. Those things I can come back to. I can make corrections on those. I can do a lot of stuff after things are done and dry. But for now, I am coming in and I'm putting in some of this warmer color, this warmer yellow into this grape. You can see that by bringing a different yellow in, it sure does shift the color of that whole grape. It makes a big difference. Now I've gone around the highlights. I'm not sure that I want them quite that crisp, so I'll rinse my brush, blot it, and soften an edge. Make sure your brush is nicely blotted when you're softening an edge, because if you don't blot your brush well, you will end up with a blossom. So I'm going to take a little bit of this phthalo, and you don't need a lot, you just need a little bit, because phthalo is a pretty powerful color. Bringing it into that yellow, and I'm going to come in around the bottom here, close to the bottom but not right at the bottom. And I've blotted my brush, as you can see. I'm going to soften this into the rest of the grape, and I'm going to come along this edge here. I need this edge a little bit lighter for a little bit of reflected light. That's what's going to help this make this look rounder, is if you've got a little bit of reflected light. So got a little bit of that in there. Now there's something still missing, and it needs a little bit of pinking up. Now somebody had asked me about pinking up pinkish green grapes, and this is where the pink will come in. So I'm going to go sort of in between those two colors with a little bit of this permanent rose. I need to blend this out. Damp brush, blotted brush, come in and put that in there. Now if you feel like that's like more than you can manage in one step, just put the one on at a time. Just put the yellow on, let it dry, re-wet the grape, put the blue on, re-wet the grape, put the red on. Don't feel like, oh my gosh, it's drying too fast and you're panicking. You can certainly just let each of those layers dry. Work as comfortably as you feel you can. But you can already see that grape looks so much more dimensional than the previous grapes, right? So coming in here and just getting a little bit more into this. And I don't want to play with that too long. You've got to get in there, put your paint on, and get out of it. Because if you play and you play and you play, you'll end up with a very patchy looking grape. So come in there, get those colors down, and get out. Or, as I said, just do one layer at a time. So I'm going to repeat the process for each of my grapes. And as I get down into some of the areas, like down in here where it's extra dark, I'm going to come in with probably a little bit of something like a neutral tint or something. Maybe even mix a little red into my green to darken it down a little bit more. right, so I'm just getting some fresh paper towel. My other one had blue on it and I'm already dirty. But okay, so let's, I can't do this one. I really can't do any of them except for maybe this one. So I'll work on this one. And same sort of thing. I'm going to work around my highlight and soften if I need to. And this gamboge, this is like a nice bright warm yellow. All right, so you may not have gamboge, but maybe you've got something very similar. The one thing I would probably advise against is using opaque colors for this particular technique. I want those underlayers to show through. I think those underlayers are quite important. So I'm coming around here with a clean blotted brush. I'm going to soften these highlights. Just paint water in that spot. Just let that be a nice soft highlight. And I'm painting, this is the warm gamboge color. And then I'll come in with a little bit of my phthalo blue mixed into that. Not phthalo blue straight, I'm mixing it into my gamboge. And I'm coming in, but not the darkest at the edge. That's not what will make it look round. You need to have, if you want it to look round, you need to have that little bit of reflected light on the edge. It depends, right? It will depend on where it is, like what's against it and so on. So, you know, it's going to get darker down there, but if I really want to make the shape, I'm going to need to get a little bit more of a deeper green color right here. So I'll come in with a little bit of permanent rose, rinsed out my brush there, and a little bit of permanent rose in here. Cleaning my brush in between because I don't want to stir up these colors too much. You know that we've got all the primaries here, right? So we've got yellow, red, and blue, and you know what happens when you mix all of those together, you get mud. So I am working very deliberately not to layer my red over my dark green and things like that. It's getting a little bit more of the red in other areas, not on the green. Come in here, blot that, lift that highlight out. Remember we lifted that out and got that really nice and soft before. And the softness of the highlight will determine whether or not there's shine on the grape or if it's a more of a matte finish, right? So these grapes have a little bit of bloom on them. Bloom being that sort of frosty or dusty looking finish on it. I'm just going to read back in the comments here, just make sure I haven't missed any questions. Mostly greetings. So we've got, okay, you're talking about paper sources. Okay. Fontaine paper. I don't know that one. 100% cotton. Yeah, as long as you got cotton paper, you can do this technique quite well. If you're working on a synthetic paper, you're going to struggle a little bit because the paint tends to sit a little bit more on top. All right, so I'm going to take a chance here. I'm going to work on this one. So there's almost always somewhere where you can work in your painting, but if you get to the point where you can't work on something, don't risk it. Go in and dry what you have before you continue on. I'll just try to keep my hand out of that wet paint. So I'm going to come around this grape with the gamboge. Coming down into here. I'm going to rinse my brush and make sure that this has a lighter edge up here because I want it to look round, so I need to have it transition there a little bit. And I need to blot my brush and soften this shadow, or this highlight I should say. There we go. Come in with a little bit of my phthalo blue and gamboge mix. And this one's getting pretty dark down in here, so I'm going to really shape this grape a little bit more. And you can see every time I start to build up shadows that things get a little bit more dimensional. Like, doesn't that start to look like it's so much more three-dimensional than this one? This one looks very flat. So one of the reasons that a lot of your paintings might look a little bit on the flat side is simply you're not building enough layers. And maybe you're afraid to build layers because you haven't been using quality paper. So I would suggest upgrading your paper and go ahead and put those layers in, because those layers can make a huge difference. I'm going to wet this again. Add maybe a little bit more down in here. Phthalo blue and the gamboge. Really getting some good shape in there. And there's actually a gap in here where we have, you can see between grapes. I'm just going to fill that in for now. Really getting up on the tiptoe of my brush so I can get into those really tight corners. Pay attention to those corners, they're important. All right. I'd love to work more on that, but I can't. So I'm going to leave it, and I'll revisit it if I have to. So I'm going to give this a dry, just because I want to work on some of these. Well, I'll dry it out. I'm going to do these ones first, then I can come back to those. Maybe that'll be dry by then. So I'm going to go gamboge here, and going to get into here. Now there's a little tiny highlight right in here. I'm just going to paint around it. It's only small. Yeah, I would stay away from things like the cad yellows, mostly because the cad yellows are opaque, and they are not good colors for glazing when they're opaque, because instead of enhancing the colors underneath, they cover them up. And so I want to maintain my colors underneath. I don't want to lose them. I want to keep that sort of translucency in those grapes. So I want to make sure I'm using transparent color here. I'm going to mix a little bit of red into this green just to dull it down a little bit. It's in the shadows. It's going to get a little darker. So I've taken my green. Now you've got to be very careful with your ratios here. So I've got my green. I can put a little bit of red in there. You put too much red in there and you're going to kill that color. But I can put a little red in there, and you see I can shift that to a much darker green. And I've got to wet my brush or dampen my brush and blot it. And I got to make sure that I don't get any hard edges here, so I'm tickling some of those edges with my brush and getting that softer. So that grape it's being covered more by the other grapes, so it needs to be darker. And I'll get into the part below as well, but I'm going to finish these grapes. So I'm going to come into the next one, starting the same way. There's a little highlight right in here. I'm going to work around that, keep that little highlight dry. So I'm going to come in here. This is gamboge I'm using. And this is where when you have two different areas that you've worked in and they overlap slightly, I mean, obviously you don't want to leave a white margin in there. So you come as close as you can, but I mean, let's face it, we're not machines. You're going to overlap, and that's going to give you a dark line. And I'll show you later how to get rid of that. Don't stop to sort of fix that. The more you try to fix it, the worse it's likely to get. So I would just leave it for now. We can come back. That's an easy fix, actually. So I'm going to come in here and make sure that and get a little bit duller green. I think this green's a little bit too bright. So I'm going to dull down this green slightly. Brush is too wet because it's not staying where I'm putting it, so I'm drinking it up, blotting my brush, and getting that under control. All right, so I've got some shadow there from the grape above. And don't assume where the shadows are. You need to look to see, is it really darkest at the edge or is it really darkest in the middle? Because not every one of these grapes, even though they're all kind of similar in shape and everything, it's not a formula that is, or a pattern that's going to repeat because of the way the light is hitting it. So you do have to look at every grape you're doing and make sure that you're placing your shadows appropriately. So I'm coming in here with a little bit darker right in there. Let that melt in. Okay, so that's getting rounder and rounder every time I do some more. So that's probably not too bad, but because phthalo is such a strong color, I'm going to err on the side of caution and I'm going to quickly dry this. So move this out of the way and dry this. Especially this phthalo that I did above. That's one of those colors that you really don't want to reactivate as you're painting your grapes. This is a heat gun. I have no masking fluid on here, so I can use heat. It's not a big deal. Most of the time, however, I do like to let it dry naturally. There's just something different about allowing it to dry naturally. It tends to melt a little bit better. It leaves the paper in a little bit better condition, that type of thing. So I like the dryer in terms of speeding things up, but I try not to dry too much when I'm painting because I don't like the way, like how the paper behaves after I've dried it. I don't feel that it looks quite as fluid as well. So I do a lot of drying because I do a lot of teaching and, you know, online stuff and that sort of thing. But most of the time when I'm painting on my own, I really don't do that much drying. You know, I'll just, you know, if I have a break, I'll just go grab a coffee or something. You know, I will wait it out. So I'm going to come in now with some of this gamboge and I'm going to paint this grape. I have to make sure that as I'm painting one grape, I'm maintaining the shape of the one beside it. I don't want to suddenly lose the shape of this grape because I was sloppy about this edge here or something like that. All right, so we've got some nice warmth in here. So you see a lot of the green that's coming out of this is pure mixture. I haven't used any colors out of a tube for a green, that is. I haven't used any greens that you buy. I've mixed them all. And the reason I like mixing them more than I like buying a tube of green is because it really gives me a greater range and a more convincing green, to be honest. So I want to soften that highlight a little bit. And I'm going to do it a little different this time. I'm going to put the pink on first. Try a little bit of the pink first. It really doesn't matter too much the order you do it in, as long as things are fluid enough to accept that that color. Remember, every layer that you put on needs to be drier than the paper, or at least as dry as, not wetter. As soon as it's wetter, you're in trouble. Okay, there's quite a bit of light bouncing onto the table and back under this grape, so I want to be very careful not to put too much of this darker green under the bottom of the grape. So I'm rinsing this and making sure it's softened. I'm trying not to allow any edges to dry crisp if possible. But if it happens, then sometimes playing with it too long can really get you into trouble. It's almost better to just let the hard line dry, re-wet it, and then massage it to move it around a little bit. Just keep in mind we're using a staining color, right? So if a staining color dries hard, it's very difficult to smooth it out. Bria's asking, is there a close replacement to the Rose D'Or in my palette? Scarlet Lake is very close to Rose D'Or, if you have that. It's an orange red. Yeah, I would say Scarlet Lake is probably the closest to that. But our grapes are certainly looking more luscious, definitely more round. Like these ones look definitely more round than this one. Now, one of the things about grapes and other fruit and anything with shape like this is that you've got these highlights. The highlights cannot show if the grape is too pale. So we want to keep the luminosity, and we need the color, but we also need to keep some of the highlight. It won't show if these colors are too pale. So always keep that in mind. So often I get asked, how can I make this highlight look brighter? Well, you can't. You can't make a highlight look brighter. It's as white as the paper practically here. So what you need to do is darken something else. And so check your values on what you've got in order to determine whether or not your highlights show up. So I'm going to come into my last couple of grapes here. There's always a little highlight somewhere, so let's get that in there. Sometimes it's a crisp highlight, depends on how wet the grape is. Some of them have a little bit more of a soft highlight, and some of them had less. And the reason for that was because I wet the grapes. I washed them off, and so some of them had like maybe a little bit of water still on the grape, so it was a little bit shinier. And yeah, it gives some variety there too. So I'm going above and below, I should say, the stem of the grape here, and I'm working around that. Don't really want to get that too yellow, so I'm working around that into these little places, and coming in with some of the gamboge there. Once again, phthalo blue mixed with my gamboge. If it's too bright, you can always add a little bit. You can neutralize it with the permanent rose. So green and red are complementary colors. You can always neutralize a color with its complement. And as I'm working, I'm always asking myself, is what I'm putting down supposed to be darker than what's beside it? Now, in this case, of course it is. But you've got to watch that, because sometimes people forget that what they're doing, they're just focused on what they're doing. They're not thinking about the neighbor. And you've got to think about the neighbors, the neighboring color, and whether or not that color is supposed to be lighter or darker. So we're doing value comparisons here. value comparisons, meaning, as I put a color down, I'm comparing it to the one beside it to make sure that they make sense. They have to make sense, right? Rinsing my brush, blotting it, softening. And I do try to work fairly quickly when I'm adding in 3 colors at one time. I mean, you have to, right? You only have a very narrow window in which you can work. So you do need to work fairly quickly. So often what I say to people is take a minute and look at what you're about to paint. Don't paint it and then say, oh, that doesn't look right, and try to fix it, because you're always going to have that oops look about your painting. What I mean is it's always going to look like you tried to fix it. So look carefully, paint with intention, and just do it quickly. So make a plan and then execute the plan quickly, in other words. 2 greens and another color put into. Yes, you're right, Linda. Linda says that when you buy a tube green, it needs another color added into it in order to make it more interesting, and that's very true, actually. So, like, I have several greens on my palette here. I've got a leaf green, I've got a sap green, I've got a hooker's green dark, and I use them, but I very seldom use them straight out of the tube, and that's the only green I use throughout my painting, because that can make a painting look flat in like no time. It will really flatten out your painting if you're using the same green throughout. So I'm getting a variety of greens here because I used aureolin and aureolin and phthalo blue, pardon me. I've used the gamboge and phthalo to make a green, and I've even added a little bit of the red in order to neutralize that and give me yet another green. So it's giving me a whole range in here, and it's at the same time it's helping me build up the values. So much nicer than a green out of a tube. There are nice greens. I use them all the time, especially if you're a plein air painter and you're painting outdoors a lot, and you have you might be using a lot of green. Yeah, it's nice to kind of start with your base. When you go to the paint store, they take a base color based on your color, right? So depending on the color that you're ordering, they take a base color and they will and then they will tint it, right? Then they will tint it. So that's what I would do, is I would take your main green and then I would shift it warmer, shift it cooler, shift it lighter or darker. Well, you can't shift it lighter by adding more water, but that's kind of what I would do with tube greens, like a sap green. It's not that I like sap green. I've got it on my palette, but I don't use it just by itself. I almost never do. I find it too flat. It makes my painting really lifeless. And I think especially if you're a beginner, the tendency for that is much greater, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. As a beginner, you have to learn that, you've got to observe these subtle differences. There's actually a game that I use sometimes. If I have to wait for something, if I'm waiting for an appointment or something along that nature, I'll pull out my phone, and there's a game that I use called I Love Hue, it's called. And what that game is basically it gives you a whole nice little gradation, and then you hit shuffle, and it shuffles it all up, and you have to put it back. And some of the subtle differences are very challenging, and of course the idea is to get it in fewer moves and things like that. And it's a game, and it is a color game basically, and it trains you to see hue and more subtle versions of hue, and whether it's light or dark. And in terms of sort of learning about hues and things like that, it's actually pretty good. It's a free game. You can download that on your iPhone. And it's Hue, spelled H-U-E. I love Hue. Phthalo and Azo, yes, that can be very nice. There's like 101 different ways of making a green. There really is. There's you can take your yellow and you can mix it with, if you want a dark, you can mix it with Payne's Gray or something like that. I mean, there's so many different versions of blue, and there's so many different versions of yellow. Combine all of those and then start mixing up, how light or dark it is, or neutralizing it and toning it down. Like, there's literally thousands of different greens you could make. All right, so trying to find little subtle differences in these grapes that are in the highlights. It's a little tricky up there because I've got a lot of glare on my paper. Not from your angle, but from my angle. There's a lot of glare. All right, so we're getting there. We're getting there. Boy, that needs to be a lot darker at the bottom though. So I think I can get that in before that dries. This needs to be a lot darker down here. Now remember what I said last week is that it is easier to work larger because you can get those shapes a little bit better, for a more realistic look. I'll come in here, soften that a little bit more. Okay, as much as I want to play with that a little bit more, I can feel that paper wanting to dry. So it's starting to grab my paint. That's time for me to move on. So next grape. I can revisit these numerous times. As long as I'm working on 100% cotton paper, I can revisit this several times. Catherine's saying, I guess it would follow the process of building layers of color. I've put in the highlights, etc. from my reference, but don't find the shapes are quite what I would like. Yeah, so it's the building up of the colors that is really going to make the difference there. Okay, so I'm going to come in and I'll work on these little guys in here. They're a fair bit darker, so we're gonna obviously need some more of a dark green, but I don't want it a bright green, so grab a little bit of my permanent rose to neutralize that. Oh, not too much. Okay, so I can dull that down. Putting my hand, I'm looking to see if there's anything wet before I put my hand down. So coming into some of these darker greens in here. Get right up on the tiptoe of my brush to fit into some of those shapes. A bit lighter green around here, around the stem. And then back to the darker green. So back to this darker green here. Down in this corner. You really do have to take your time with these shapes. I mean, grapes look like they're very simple, right? At a glance, but keeping the roundness is almost the biggest challenge. All right, so I've got a real dark in there. Wow, that's a real dark, but that gives me some place to really start sorting out my my lights and darks. I'm going to definitely come into some of that dark down in here, darken up some more in other areas. But I'm going to finish this last light colored grape first. Then I'll think about building shadows a little bit more. So a little bit of my gamboge in here. There's a couple of highlights. I'm going to leave those dry. At least for the moment, I will leave them dry. Little highlight right in here. Starting to come into some of my greens. Now I'm looking at the neighbor. Is this lighter or darker than the neighbor? In some places it's darker, and in other places it's just about the same. So I want to make sure that I'm not suddenly creating some sort of alternate reality by creating, shadows where shadows don't exist. So this part here, we're very close in value. Right here, we're very close in value. So I need to think about that. So remember your neighbors. Down in this little point here, it starts to get a little bit darker. I think I added a little bit more red to this, so it blackened. That's the trick you've got to remember, is that the more red you add, the more sort of black you make your green. So if you don't want it overly dark, that's a little bit dark there. We'll pull some of that off. If you don't want it overly dark, be very careful how much red you add. A little goes a very long way. All right, so we have quite a bit of dark down in here. Let's get into this shadow. So I'm going to come down in here with a darker, duller green. So I'm going to take that gamboge, I'm going to put some phthalo into it, get a darker green, little touch, not too much, of that red. Too much red, it's just going to turn a really dead color. It's going to really mix and look muddy. There is a use for sometimes those muddy colors, but you've got to be careful that you don't get too muddy a painting overall. You can have a dirty color once in a while if it's called for, but sometimes people get it and that's not what they're looking for, or that's not what they were intending. So I'm coming in here, I'm actually working on dry. And I'm going to come down here. I think I could dull this a little bit more. A little tiny bit more red added, just to darken that down a little bit. Now I'm making a really defined shape here for the moment. I will lose that line. I will lose it. I'm just going to create the shape for now. Get in there. Start blending that. And I want to make sure that I'm going to soften these edges. That's my plan, is I'm going to soften these edges so that I get a really nice, so I don't have a crisp, hard cutout shadow. This is going to have softer edges. So to get that, I need to rinse my brush quickly, work quick, dry off as much as possible here, and then run my brush along those edges to soften them. Won't work if that paint dries too quick. Might have dried a little bit quick on me there, but so you've got to be fast about it. You can't dawdle when you're rinsing and blotting your brush with the intention of softening an edge. You've got to be quick about it. One of the biggest helps is to make sure that the paint you're putting down, so I'm just darkening some of this, the paint you're putting down has to be wet enough so that there's something there to soften. Rinse, blot, and soften. Get a little more color right in here. I can re-wet a section, but trying to not play with this too much. I think I'm just going to leave that alone for now. All right. So, boy, look at that. Those grapes are really popping off against that blue, but I can see my grapes still need more shape. I think before I do too much more, though, I'd like to maybe get these stems in here. Then I have all the white areas that I don't want white will be covered. Got a really hard line here. I'm intending to get rid of that. So let's talk about these double dark lines. I call them double dark lines because you've basically put one layer of paint over another layer of paint, and it's doubled how dark it is. So, for example, I've got a kind of a dark line here. Let's talk about how to soften that up. If I blot my brush really well, and I come along here, and I just tickle that edge and blot it, and blot it, that line is now gone. So that is one way to do that. I don't know what my camera is doing there. I have no idea why it's flashing like that. No clue. Anyway, hopefully you can ignore that. Let me see. I'm just I'm reading back just to see if there's any of the questions I've missed. My two greens are Thalo and Azo. Yes, I saw that comment before. Oh, Kathy says she's doing a painting with very dark grapes. What would be the best way to develop the grapes since they are very dark? Well, you could use a different combination. You could use this method. You just have to layer more. You can darken your grape, as I said, by neutralizing it and adding a little bit more of the red to it. But you have to be extremely careful. You just have to use more pigment, really. But try different greens, try different mixtures. I typically will take a scrap of paper and do a test on my piece of paper and hold it up against the photo to make sure that I have the right family of green that I'm looking for. All right, so just like we smoothed out that wash in the background, all the layers of the greens that we're going to do, we can also smooth out things as well. So don't get too panicked. And that's why I often say to people, just don't worry too much if that first layer's a little patchy looking. Obviously try to make it smooth, but if it doesn't end up that way, don't play with it. Just let it dry. Put another layer on. Or even just that layer can be just water, as long as you sort of re-wet the color that's there and move it around. If you didn't want it any darker, that's what you do. But you can manipulate the paint that's on the paper now. So let's get these some of these branches put in here, just so that I don't start losing lines and things like that. So for my, I'm going to use, they're just basically a brown, so I'm going to take my burnt sienna and some Payne's Gray. That's what I'll do. Burnt sienna and Payne's Gray will give me a nice brown. And depending on how reddish I want it, I have either the more burnt sienna or more Payne's Gray. So that gives me my range of browns here. So I'm going to come in and paint my stem just this lighter color first, this reddish brown. And just working carefully. I'm not separating each of the things yet. I will do that with my next layer of darks. But it will start to look better just with this layer here. Just having this on here will make a difference. Okay, so that's going to dry a lighter brown, and that's fine because that's kind of what I want in some of the areas. Have to be very careful as I work up against the grape. Don't want to come over onto the grape because that will all of a sudden make that stem look like it comes on top of the grape instead of behind it. That sort of thing. So always think about the neighboring grape. You have to make sure you're working around it. So I do jump around a lot in my painting, mostly so that I can just keep painting. I don't have to stop and just wait for one area to dry. I know some people will just sort of really concentrate on one area, but I like to keep painting, so I jump around. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to let that light layer dry, then I'll come into my darker mixture over here. You can see that that camera really is too bright now. Much better. It was really too bright. There we go. All right, so I think that old camera, this is the only camera here, you know, this camera here for the palette. It's the only one that I've got that's older, and I've got a replacement. I just haven't got enough ports in my computer. I'm going to have to add another port. But now we're really starting to see some more volume. So I'm just going to keep building this up and building this up. So I'll come back and I'll revisit all of the grapes and build them up in these slow layers, and it's one by one, and it's very slow, but I like it. Am I resting my hand on my surface? Yes, only if it's dry. If it's wet, I don't. But yes, I find that I have more steadiness in my brushwork if I'm resting my hand. Some people will put a paper towel down. If you have a lot of oils in your skin, or if you tend to use hand lotion, like in wintertime, you might be using a lot of hand lotion. Definitely lay down like a clean piece of paper towel to rest your hand on, so that you don't introduce oils into your watercolor surface. What kind of heat gun? I bought this on Amazon, and it's what is this called? It's called a Ranger heated craft tool. And it's a heat gun. It is not a hairdryer, even though it looks like a hairdryer, it's a heat gun. But it's just got like sort of on and off. That's it. It doesn't have any adjustments. It's on or off. And it's hot. So it works, but don't bake your masking fluid if you're using anything with masking fluid. Yeah, I got mine on Amazon as well. Yeah, I think they do still have it. You're right. Yeah, it's quite handy, actually. I take it with me almost everywhere when I'm teaching and such. Okay, I think I got all the questions. Now it's just a matter of build, build, build. So I'm going to build up a couple of grapes. I don't know if you want to hang around while I take my time with all of this, but in some cases, let's say you've got a little bit more of an olive or a brownish color, for example, to your green. Well, instead of using a bright red like I used over here, I could also go into a burnt sienna, and that would give me more of an olive green. You know, play around, experiment with color, find out what it does. It's really important. My colors are still a little too bright, you know, a little too clean. They don't look quite as natural as what's here. I also have to build up some darks. But as I mentioned sort of earlier on in part one, you start with the brighter colors because they're easy to tone down. It's getting back a bright color that is nearly impossible in watercolor. It's not that it can't be done, but it's really, really hard. And there's certain situations where you can't recover from losing the freshness of the color. You just can't. So keep that in mind. Start off bright. You can always tone it down. So that was long enough for me to be able to come in here, and I'm going to re-wet this grape. I'm going to wet it first, just for a change, not because I need to do it any differently. Just I'm going to wet it first, and we'll see what working on a wet surface does for me versus painting on a dry surface. But I am being very careful, very cautious along that phthalo blue. There's a lot of pigment here on this phthalo blue, and it's a staining color, so I really don't want to activate it. So be very careful. So I'm wetting here. All right, so now I'm going to come in, and I can even come back to some of my original cool green if I need to. So I'm going to put some cool green up in here again. That's the aureolin mixed with the phthalo. And I can reintroduce some of those cool yellows as well. But I'm going to start building up more of the greens in here. Definitely needs to be a little darker down in here. Just you always have to remember how much lighter things are going to dry. And you might think, well, this is the only place where there's a darker green, right? Nope, there's a little bit at the top too. A little bit more up there. It gets a little bit more, let's get a clean spot here, a little bit more of that permanent rose. Easy with the permanent rose. Boy, it can really jump out at you. Very bright if you're not careful. So I'm just going to let that go right around the margins of that and let that melt into what I've got. So I do find that if I pre-wet an area, it will help the colors sort of mix a little bit more. You just have to remember that when you're working on a wet, that you do need to use a little bit more color, because when you're working on wet, it will it'll dry even extra light. So I can't do this one, but I can do this one. So I will come down here. I'm going to wet the shape. I'm going to work around that highlight just because it's a little bit brighter, like it's a little bit crisper, like the edges of that highlight are a little crisper. And so if that's the case, I need to work on a drier paper. I need to keep those edges drier. Everything else I've wet. I'm going to come in with some gamboge, a little touch of red maybe. build this up a little more. I like that little bit of reddish color in there. I'm looking at my reference. There's a little tiny bit of reddish color in this reference. And sometimes you really have to hunt for color. Trying to get something out of the way there. May not jump out you as, oh, look, there's a big patch of red. You know, you might actually kind of have to look and detect it as a subtle thing. So coming in with some of that permanent rose here before I get back into my greens down in here. And everything being wet is really making that melt together a little bit more. So that I'm getting a little bit of that sort of pinkish green, probably a little bit more than the reference. That's okay. I don't mind that at all. I like, I don't mind my photo or my painting being slightly different than the reference. I mean, I could take the time and try to fix it and make it exactly the same. I just don't think it's necessary. I like it, so I'm keeping it. Don't be afraid to deviate a little bit from your reference. I need to keep some luminosity in here, so I'm going to come in here with a little more yellow. Yellow is a great way to introduce that glow, that luminosity, that type of thing. But as I come into the grapes below, I can see I definitely need to get darker there. Like I've got this grape darker than the one below, and it's got to be the opposite way, right? Look, when you look here, you can see this grape has to be a lot lighter than this one. And I've already darkened it down a fair bit. So I need to come in and really get a lot darker there, but I have to wait. So where can I work? I can work somewhere else. I will start off by wetting the grape with clean water. And I'll come in with a little bit more. I need to come around this highlight. Otherwise that highlight just will not ever show. It's just not going to exist. A little bit of that reddish color in here, like that. More yellowy green. And let that make that shape. All right, so I've got a little funny little spot in here. I don't think I did anything with that before, so I need to come in there and get this little guy toned down. He's like really jumping out from the background there because he's so light. Need to push him back into shadows a little bit more. In fact, I'm going to kind of blend these two grapes together just so that they don't have too much definition. I'm going to blend them together. So I'm taking some of the paint. I didn't add anything there. It's just water. And it's mixing together and toning down the one above and making the one below more like sort of mixed in. We're back to thunder here where the storm is resuming, so hopefully our power holds out. That would not be fun. We've had a number of power outages lately. It's not good. And I'm going to just tickle that edge, make sure that softens up a little bit between those grapes. And so that's really pushed that back into a darker shadow there. Might even put a little bit more right here just to push that back a little more. A little red in it just to neutralize it. I don't want a bright green when it's a darker shadow. It does need to be a duller green back there. It's interesting that dull colors will push back, brighter colors will come forward. Burnt sienna and yeah, we'll just mix a burnt sienna into your green mixture, Margot, to give you a more olive looking green. I could also use, like if I wanted a more olive looking green, you could change up your yellow, for example. Maybe you can hear some of that thunder. It's getting kind of loud. But if I were to take my phthalo blue, for example, and mix it with raw sienna, that's going to give me a more of an olive. Yeah, let's hope the power holds out. It's really getting quite boisterous out there, shall we say? Yeah, not burnt sienna and Payne's Gray. Burnt sienna and Payne's Gray it'll give you like a really dark. It will be in the olive family, but it'll be like extremely dark. But for a lighter olive, you can do that. There's umpteen different ways that you can actually create an olive color. All right, so things are still drying, and drying lighter than I want, so I just have to keep pressing on here. I'm going to wet this grape. Let's do this before our power goes out. Back to my gamboge and phthalo blue. I want to put a little bit of red into this. A little bit of red will kind of dull that down. You'll see it'll change that green a little bit. I want to get some more of that. I don't know, can you hear it? Can you hear it out there? A little bit more red in here. Uh-oh, lights are flickering. All right, so let's talk about, just in case, we'll talk about the finishing up of this. It's more or less just more building like this, but I want to talk about getting rid of these crisp edges down here. I want what they call a lost edge, so that those lines don't show anymore. So as I re-wet this to put more color in here, I am going to come right over and into my shadow. And you can see that if I massage that a little bit, that line starts to fade and go away. But I've got to definitely come in and soften things up. And I'm going to kind of connect all of this. This is just clean water I'm using. Wet all out here. And so all of that is wet. And I'm going to come in with more color, adding a little bit more of that permanent rose to it to dull that down a little bit, darken it a little bit. And I'm really going to come in here and start to melt those together. And you can see that you really don't even see the line. I mean, it's barely detectable. And that's what I'm after, just that barely detectable line. I need it darker against this grape. A little bit more dark back in here too. That line there between the, this grape isn't that bright or isn't that crisp. So yeah, lights are flickering. I'm not really confident that I'm going to have power for the duration of this, but I'm going to come in with a bit of red got a hair on my, this isn't a brush hair, this is my hair. In here, a little bit more red, really dulling this down. But this area here is not as red. I need to make sure that it's a little bit, still a little bit lighter, but not bright in that area. All right, so we've got some darks in there, and you can see that that line, now that that grape is really starting to disappear into the shadows. If I do inadvertently disappear, that will be the end of this live demo, but I'm trying to cover what's left here. So working quickly, gotta work fast. When you've wet a surface, you've really gotta, you can't dawdle, you have to really move. So I'm coming in, really wanna get this shadow here established. Feel like this is starting to dry a little bit, so I'm just blotted my brush here, clean water, and I'm re-wetting most of this, leaving that little highlight right there. Just painting around that little tiny white spot. And come in and get that edge vanishing into the shadow on the table. Nice wet brush. If you work too dry, you're really going to run into more difficulty than if you really fill up your brush and get things melting together. If you don't have enough in your brush, you have the tendency to try to work it together with your brush. That is one of the recipes that's going to give you a lot of brush marks and uneven blending and that sort of thing. I'm going to bring a little bit more red in here. I love these little variations in color. I think that those are so great when it comes to creating the roundness of things, giving them a little bit of glow. I'm going to put a little bit more in here too. Getting a little bit of a dark edge here, so I'm going to pull that up right now before it dries and gives me a problem. Just thirsty brush, just pull that up. All right, so work that in there. We'll see, might have to put more in there, but for now I'm happy enough. And I'm going to even go right into this grape. Even though it's right next to the other one, I'm not going to get it really soaking wet. I'm just going to dampen it. Build just a little more in there, just so you can see how I'm sort of layering up and getting more volume out of this. More pink, pinkish color. Seems a little darker here for some reason. It's a little darker through here. But I definitely need a little bit of something right above that highlight, because that highlight wasn't showing the way I need it. So it means I've got to get more color in here. I thought it was light enough. I thought I had enough shadow. But now I feel like that's even better. So many times I see students that are too afraid to add more. And very often it's that one final push that really makes it happen, right? So to get that highlight, I needed to go darker around it. It needed it. I was nervous. Admittedly, I was nervous, but look how that highlight is showing, right? I can come in and I can create that highlight really getting a little bit more volume to this grape, and it's really starting to look more rounded and so on. So I'm going to come back into the stem. Like, you've seen how I'm building up the grapes. I'm going to come into the stem now with the burnt sienna Payne's Gray mixture, but more Payne's Gray now. And I'm going to just paint in and leave behind some of the highlights. So I'm going to paint in this texture here. Some of it's almost just straight Payne's Gray. It's so dark. I'm just warming it up just slightly with the burnt sienna. And so I'm looking for gaps. I'm looking for, where do I not paint? So I want to not paint the highlights, so I paint around them. Oops, I wasn't watching there. Looked away and made a mark. It's okay. Some of these stems are almost black, but there's a couple of little bits that are the lighter brown in there, so that's what I'm leaving behind. Oh, there's a little one down here I missed. Right there. All right, so some of my brown's a little bit dark. I'll just lift that off. Just use my damp brush, my paper towel, lift that out a little bit higher, a little bit lighter. There, so I can make something a little bit lighter there, and that'll be fine for my stem. Couple of little lighter spots. Adjust that as you need. So that's just about covering it. I think the one thing I really want to build up a little more is this shadow here. I really want this grape to look like it's on top of this one, so I need to build this up in this little space here. So my gamboge, my phthalo blue, gives me a good dark green, but way too bright. Clean up my yellow there on my palette. And I'm going to go into my permanent rose. So I get a duller green. Now I wet that area first to get that dark enough. And what a difference, right? Coming in with that dark. I can see other areas where I can definitely come in and clean it up. Down in here, for example, I could get a little bit darker in here. That type of thing. Moving that edge. That grape wasn't very round, was it? So we'll fix that. This area is a little bit dark. I'm going to soften some of this. I want a disappearing edge there. I don't want to have a really prominent edge there. And run a damp brush along there. Really get that a little bit darker there too. All right, so that's the build-up, and I think that's, if I just keep continuing with layers like I've done here, dulling down some of my darks as I go, building them up so that I'm always comparing to the next grape or the next value beside where I'm painting to make sure that I'm building things up correctly. That's going to give me a more completed painting. And don't be afraid to take it that one extra step. So many paintings just look like they're so close. That's just, if you'd only taken it one step further, that often I see that when it's just too many paintings are you're too afraid to take the risk, and that it shows. It shows when you paint and you're too chicken. So go ahead and be a little braver when you're painting. It's only a piece of paper. You'll never discover how far you can go with your painting until you're out of your comfort zone.